I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. I speak today not to announce a verdict, but to draw a line in the sand. What unfolded with the arrest of Paul-Henri Damiba is not a single man's fall. It is a mirror held up to a system that believed Burkina Faso could be steered from the shadows. I have survived plots, whispers, and warnings that arrived in the night. Each time, the timing was the same. When we chose dignity over dependence, when we closed old doors and opened new ones. This moment forces us to ask who benefits from chaos and why truth is always the first target. I want to begin with what many prefer not to name directly, yet everyone feels in their bones. The long shadow of France in Africa did not vanish when flags were lowered and anthems were changed. It learned to move quietly. It learned to wait. I grew up hearing elders speak of independence as a moment in time, as if it happened once and then stayed forever. But sovereignty is not a date on a calendar. It is a daily struggle against habits, dependencies, and invisible hands that insist they know our future better than we do. When Captain Damiba governed, Burkina Faso still walked inside an old security architecture. It was familiar, comfortable for some, profitable for others. French military cooperation remained structured as it had been for decades, with decision-making channels that ran outward before they ran inward. Many accepted this as normal. I did not. After I came to power, we made choices that unsettled that balance. We asked foreign troops to leave. We questioned agreements signed long before my generation had a voice. We said openly that Burkina Faso would no longer outsource its dignity, even if that path felt dangerous. From that moment, the air changed. I am not saying that France ordered conspiracies or signed secret papers calling for my removal. That would be too simple and too convenient. Power today does not operate that way. Influence works through relationships, expectations, and networks that predate any single leader. What we confronted was not a command, but resistance. Resistance from people who had built careers, reputations, and wealth within the old system. Resistance from those who believed that a young officer speaking of sovereignty was a temporary storm that could be waited out or redirected. Damiba, whether by choice or circumstance, became associated with that older order. To some, he symbolized continuity, to others, reassurance. When he fell, it was not just a change of leadership, it was a rupture. That rupture frightened many beyond our borders. I remember the weeks after our pivot away from France. Diplomatic language grew colder, advice became warnings, warnings became silence, and silence, in geopolitics, is rarely neutral. It is often the space where other conversations happen. Within Burkina Faso, messages began circulating, not proclamations but suggestions. That the country was moving too fast, that the army was divided, that I was isolated, that stability required familiar partners. Stability, that word has been used against Africa more than any weapon. For decades, stability meant predictable obedience. It meant contracts untouched, bases unquestioned, and leaders who understood the limits of their independence. When I rejected that definition, I did not expect applause, but I did not expect the intensity of what followed either. Rumors of plots emerged not from paranoia but from patterns. The same intermediaries appeared. The same voices reassured certain officers that nothing would change if I were gone. The same nostalgic language returned, praising an era that never truly served our people. This is how France-Afrique survives, not as a formal empire but as a mindset, a belief that Africa's role is to provide, not to decide. That our leaders are temporary managers of resources destined for elsewhere. I reject that belief with every breath. Let me be clear. This is not a speech against the French people. It is not even against France as a nation. It is against a system of influence that treats African sovereignty as negotiable and African leaders as replaceable when they stop complying. The trial of Damiba, whatever its legal outcome, exposed something deeper. It exposed how quickly old alliances react when their relevance is threatened. It exposed how power does not need tanks when it has access, memory, and patience. I ask my brothers and sisters across Africa to reflect on this. How many times have reformist leaders faced sudden instability just as they challenged inherited structures? How often has concern from abroad coincided with internal disruption? These are not coincidences. They are patterns. For me, this realization was sobering, not empowering. It forced me to confront the cost of the path I chose. It forced me to accept that independence is lonely work, that when you close one door, many corridors collapse with it. But I would choose it again, because the alternative is a quiet surrender. A life of managed obedience dressed as partnership, and that to me is a slower form of death. What we are witnessing now is not revenge, nor spectacle. It is exposure. A moment where old mechanisms are dragged into the light, not to be condemned blindly, but to be understood clearly. Only by naming these forces can we ensure they no longer define us. And yet, this is only one layer of the story. Behind influence lies coordination. Behind coordination lies something even harder to trace. Beyond the visible networks of influence, there exists a quieter realm where deniability is currency and distance is protection. I speak now of certain Western security and intelligence structures, not as named enemies, but as abstract systems that shape outcomes without ever appearing on the stage. When Burkina Faso began to change its orientation, the first reactions were public and diplomatic, statements about concern, speeches about values. But what followed did not arrive through microphones or press releases. It arrived through channels designed to leave no fingerprints. I learned quickly that modern interference rarely announces itself. It presents as advice offered through intermediaries, as funding that appears suddenly in unexpected places, as logistical support disguised as private initiative. The question is never who gives orders, but who creates conditions. In the months after our strategic shift away from the West and toward new partners, particularly Russia, several plots were uncovered. Each had different faces, different actors, and different justifications. But the timing was always synchronized, always aligned with moments when our new direction became irreversible. I do not accuse any specific agency, because accusation without proof is noise. What I speak of is pattern recognition. The same methods have been observed across continents. When a government diverges too sharply from established Western security frameworks, instability often follows, not as punishment, but as correction. This correction is subtle. Communications become easier for those who oppose the government. Resources move more freely. Borders feel more porous. Information that should remain compartmentalized somehow circulates. Someone always benefits from this permeability. I remember one night when intelligence reached my desk about a planned attempt on my life. The details were precise: routes, times, contingencies. What disturbed me most was not the plot itself, but the professionalism behind it. This was not amateur dissent. This was coordination. Yet when traced, every trail dissolved into plausible deniability. Private contractors, former officers, now consultants, non-governmental intermediaries claiming neutrality. The architecture of interference has evolved to survive scrutiny. In this system, no one needs to say, "Remove him." It is enough to suggest that a leader is becoming unreliable, that the country is drifting, that risks are increasing. Once that narrative takes hold, others act accordingly, each believing they are responding, not initiating. Damiba's name surfaced repeatedly in these undercurrents, not necessarily as a mastermind, but as a reference point. A familiar node. Someone whose return would signal a restoration of predictability. Whether he intended this or not is for history to judge. But symbols often matter more than intentions. For Western security structures accustomed to long-standing relationships in the Sahel, my leadership represented uncertainty. I did not come from their training programs. I did not speak their language of calibrated obedience. I spoke plainly. I questioned assumptions. I asked why African blood paid for strategies designed elsewhere. That made me difficult to manage. And when management fails, systems look for alternatives. I must emphasize something important. Not every Western institution operates this way. Not every analyst or officer seeks destabilization. Many genuinely believe they are preventing chaos. But belief does not absolve consequence. When the framework itself assumes African agency is dangerous, outcomes follow naturally. This is how instability is rationalized, not as malice, but as necessity. For an audience in the United States, I ask you to consider this carefully. Imagine a foreign power quietly facilitating opposition within your borders because your government chose a different alliance. Imagine communications enhanced, resources flowing, and narratives shaped, all while official channels deny involvement. You would call it interference. We are often told to call it support for stability. Nigeria, my brother nation, knows this language well. Africa knows it intimately. What we confront today is not the Cold War of yesterday, but a fragmented competition where influence replaces ideology and plausible deniability replaces declaration. In this environment, young leaders who speak too directly are seen as risks to be managed. I did not step into this role seeking confrontation. I sought survival for my people, but survival itself became politicized the moment we refused to outsource it. The trial surrounding Damiba illuminated this shadow world without fully naming it. Testimonies hinted at external facilitation, communications that could not be explained internally, movements that exceeded domestic capacity, nothing definitive, everything suggestive. That is how these systems protect themselves. I live with the knowledge that I remain a target, not because I am dangerous, but because I am inconvenient. An inconvenience in geopolitics is often more threatening than hostility. Yet even this is not the whole picture. External systems alone cannot destabilize a nation. They require internal doors to be left open. Those doors were not left open by accident. I must now turn inward, because no foreign influence succeeds without local hands. This is the hardest part to speak about, not because it is secret, but because it is familiar. Every nation carries within it a memory of its former power structures. In Burkina Faso, as in many African states, the military and political elites formed over decades of conditional loyalty. Promotions were earned not only through service but through alignment. Budgets flowed along trusted lines. Authority was inherited as much as it was earned. When the events of the year 2022 unfolded, many of these structures fractured overnight. Some men lost rank, others lost access, others lost relevance. What they did not lose was their network. I did not come to power promising revenge. I promised reform. But reform, to those who benefit from disorder disguised as order, feels like punishment. It feels like erasure. Within weeks of assuming leadership, I sensed the resistance. It was not loud, it was procedural. Files delayed, intelligence incomplete, orders followed with hesitation rather than conviction. Loyalty expressed verbally but not operationally. This is how institutions signal discomfort. Damiba, as a former head of state and senior officer, became a focal point for those displaced by change. He represented a possible return to familiarity. To them, he was not simply a man, but a reminder of how things used to work. Some officers spoke his name with nostalgia, others with calculation. I want to be clear again. This is not a declaration of guilt. It is an observation of dynamics. Power vacuums attract ambition, and ambition, when combined with grievance, becomes dangerous. Information began to leak from within. Not grand secrets, but enough to create vulnerability. Movement schedules, security rotations, internal disagreements exaggerated and shared. These were not acts of ideology. They were acts of self-preservation by those who felt excluded from the future. I often ask myself whether I could have handled this differently, whether a slower pace would have eased the shock, whether compromise would have bought stability. These are not academic questions. They are the questions that keep a leader awake. But then, I remember why the old system collapsed in the first place. It collapsed because it could not protect our people. It collapsed because soldiers died without purpose, while funds disappeared without trace. It collapsed because the population lost faith. Restoring that system even partially would not have brought peace. It would have delayed reckoning. The internal networks aligned around Damiba did not need to succeed militarily to be effective. Their mere existence created uncertainty. And uncertainty weakens morale faster than bullets. Every rumor of a coup attempt forces a government to divert attention. Every whispered plot creates suspicion within the ranks. Trust erodes. Focus fractures. This is how states are softened before they are broken. I addressed the armed forces directly. I told them that loyalty to a person is fragile, but loyalty to a mission endures. Some understood. Some did not. Those who did not began to look outward for reinforcement. And there, they found willing listeners. This convergence of internal grievance and external encouragement is where danger lives. Neither force alone is decisive. Together, they become momentum. The trial process revealed fragments of this reality. Testimony spoke of meetings held quietly, of assurances given without authority, of expectations that change could be reversed if the right pressure was applied. What struck me most was not the ambition but the miscalculation, a belief that the people would accept another reversal, that fatigue would overcome memory, that fear would silence conviction. They misunderstood the moment. Burkina Faso has suffered too much to return blindly. Our people may be patient, but they are not forgetful. They know who stood with them when villages burned and who negotiated comfort from afar. I do not claim moral purity. I am a product of this system too. But I chose to break from it, knowing the cost. Internal elites who resist this break often frame their actions as patriotism. They tell themselves they are preventing chaos. But when patriotism serves only those who have already benefited, it becomes a shield for self-interest. This is not unique to Burkina Faso. Nigeria has wrestled with it. The United States has its own version. Power everywhere resists redistribution. What matters is how a society responds. We chose to confront it, not with mass purges or public humiliation, but with exposure. By allowing processes to unfold, even when they are painful. By trusting that truth, though slow, is stronger than fear. Still, internal resistance is only one layer of the pressure we face. There is another force, quieter still, that thrives on instability rather than ideology, and it follows the money. There is a kind of power that never gives speeches, never issues statements, and never appears in uniform. It moves through contracts, concessions, and quiet transfers of value. It does not care who governs, only who signs. In Burkina Faso, that power is most visible in gold. For years, our soil has produced wealth that rarely lingered long enough to change the lives of those who live above it. Agreements were signed in distant rooms, written in technical language, protected by clauses few citizens ever saw. Security around these operations was often provided not by the state but by private arrangements whose loyalties were defined by payment, not flag. When my government began reviewing these contracts, I was warned repeatedly. Not directly, never openly, but through the language of risk. I was told investors would flee, that production would slow, that instability would follow. What they meant was resistance. We did not move recklessly. We did not nationalize overnight. We asked simple questions. Who benefits? Who decides? Who protects? And why the state, which carries the consequences, receives so little control? Those questions unsettled powerful interests. I remember one briefing where an advisor told me, almost kindly, that certain arrangements were too big to disturb, that these networks had survived multiple governments, that pushing them would invite problems unrelated to economics. He was right about one thing: problems did follow. Funding streams that had remained invisible for years suddenly intersected with political agitation. Security incidents clustered around sensitive negotiations. Voices that had never spoken publicly about governance became suddenly vocal about rule of law. It was not ideology that animated them, it was continuity. Private security firms, intermediaries, and extraction-linked actors thrive in ambiguity. They prefer weak states that depend on them. A government that seeks oversight threatens their business model. In that environment, instability is not a crisis, it is leverage. Damiba's name again appeared in conversations not because of policy alignment, but because of predictability. Under his leadership, contracts were understood, relationships were established, questions were limited. This does not mean he orchestrated anything, but systems remember what works for them, and they attempt to restore it when disrupted. I do not believe in conspiracies where everyone meets in one room. Real power does not need coordination at that level. It relies on shared interest. When enough actors benefit from uncertainty, uncertainty becomes inevitable. Gold is not the only resource at stake. Logistics, transport corridors, and informal taxation routes all intersect with security dynamics. When the state strengthens its grip, those margins shrink. Those who live off margins respond. I often reflect on how different our politics would look if resources were transparent, if contracts were public, if wealth had names attached to it. Many conflicts would lose their fuel overnight. But transparency is dangerous to those who profit from shadows. This is why economic reform and security reform cannot be separated. A government that threatens hidden wealth will be framed as destabilizing. A leader who asks too many questions will be described as reckless. I have been called many things in recent months. Young, inexperienced, radical. None of these frighten me as much as being called manageable. Because manageable leaders do not change systems, they maintain them. The trial atmosphere surrounding Damiba exposed how deeply economic interests intertwine with political ambition. Testimonies hinted at financing that did not originate from ideology or loyalty, but from expectation. An expectation that a different leadership would be easier to negotiate with. That expectation is not criminal by itself, but when it translates into support for destabilization, it crosses a line. I am not naive. I know resources attract competition, but competition must occur within the rules of a sovereign state, not through pressure, manipulation, or violence. Burkina Faso's wealth must no longer be a reason for its fragility. It must become the foundation of its strength. Yet even money does not act alone. It often rides waves of violence created by others. And there are those who exploit chaos not for contracts, but for territory. There are forces that do not sit at negotiating tables, do not draft contracts, and do not care who signs them. They move through gaps created by fear. They listen for weakness. They advance when states are distracted. I speak now of armed groups and regional actors who benefit from instability without necessarily creating it. They are not the architects of chaos, but they are its most eager tenants. For years, Burkina Faso has lived with the weight of insecurity, villages emptied, roads avoided, families displaced not once, but repeatedly. These groups learned our rhythms. They learned when the army was focused inward, when leadership was uncertain, when command structures hesitated. Every rumor of a coup is an invitation to them. When plots against my government were uncovered, violence often spiked elsewhere. Not as coordination in a legal sense, but as opportunism. Armed groups understand timing instinctively. They feel when a state's attention is divided. Borders in the Sahel are lines on maps, not barriers on the ground. Weapons move, fighters move. Information moves faster than any official communique. When instability appears in one country, it echoes in its neighbors. This is why internal political games in Africa never remain internal. I have been asked whether these groups were involved in the alleged efforts surrounding Damiba. That question misunderstands how modern conflict works. Involvement does not always mean instruction. Sometimes it means anticipation. When the state weakens, even briefly, armed groups expand their space. They recruit more easily. They negotiate from strength. They present themselves as alternatives where government presence fades. I saw this clearly in the days following certain attempted destabilizations. Attacks were not random. They targeted symbolic locations. They aimed to send a message. The state is distracted, and we are watching. This creates a vicious cycle. Political instability feeds insecurity. Insecurity feeds political pressure, and those who benefit from either are rarely invested in resolution. Some regional actors, too, find advantage in this turbulence. Smuggling networks thrive when oversight weakens. Informal taxation expands when official authority retreats. Chaos becomes an economy of its own. In this environment, leaders who promise order through reform are inconvenient. They disrupt informal arrangements that depend on disorder. They insist on coordination where fragmentation once ruled. I am under no illusion that one government can eliminate these forces overnight. But I know this: they grow stronger when states are manipulated from within. Every attempt to divide our armed forces, every whisper of betrayal, every rumor of reversal, gives space to those who want Burkina Faso permanently unstable. That is why I treat political plots not as elite drama, but as national security threats, because their consequences are paid not in speeches, but in lives. The trial context brought this reality into focus. It reminded us that instability is never abstract. It always finds expression in blood, displacement, and despair. I often think of the mothers in rural communities who do not care about geopolitics. They care whether their children return home. They care whether schools open. They care whether markets are safe. To them, leadership is not ideology, it is presence. When power struggles distract the state, those mothers pay the price. This is why I refuse to allow Burkina Faso to become a chessboard for others, not for former allies, not for economic interests, not for armed opportunists. Our security challenges are severe, but they will never be solved by returning to old dependencies or recycled leadership. They require coherence, honesty, and a refusal to be divided. What I have described so far may sound heavy. It is, but it is not the end of the story. Because despite these pressures, despite these forces, I remain here. And Burkina Faso remains standing. The question now is not who tried to destabilize us, but what kind of future we choose in response. That choice belongs not only to leaders, but to citizens and to those watching us from afar. Before I speak of promises and conclusions, I must first speak of responsibility. I have spoken at length about forces, pressures, and dangers, but before I ask anyone to judge these events, I must speak about myself. I am not a perfect man. I am not immune to doubt. There are nights when I ask whether the weight of this responsibility exceeds my strength. I am young in years, but age is not what prepares a person for betrayal or for the knowledge that one's decisions can cost lives. What keeps me standing is not ideology, it is memory. I remember the faces of soldiers sent into battle without clarity. I remember villages that disappeared quietly, without cameras or headlines. I remember promises made to our people that never arrived because something else always came first. A contract, an alliance, a convenience. I promised myself that if I ever held power, it would not be to preserve comfort for a few, but to restore meaning for many. That promise has cost me peace, it has cost me sleep, it has placed a target on my back, but it has also given my life direction. I do not seek to rule forever, I seek to repair what was broken long before my name mattered. And I accept that repair is never clean, it is slow, it is contested. It exposes wounds people would rather keep covered. To the people of Burkina Faso, I say this plainly. I will not sell your future to buy my safety. I will not exchange your dignity for my comfort. If I must live carefully so that the nation may live freely, then that is a trade I accept. To Africa, I say this as a brother. Our greatest enemy is not any foreign power. It is our habit of mistrusting ourselves. Every time we believe that stability must come from outside, we weaken the inside. Every time we accept that our role is to follow, we forget that history has never moved forward without those willing to lead differently. I do not ask African leaders to imitate me. I ask them to ask their own difficult questions. Who benefits from our fear? Who profits from our hesitation? And who pays when we choose silence over courage? To the people of the United States and Nigeria who are listening, especially those who have lived long enough to see cycles repeat, I ask for something simple. Look beyond headlines. Look beyond labels. Ask not whether a leader is convenient, but whether a people are finally being heard. I do not ask for approval. I ask for understanding. Burkina Faso's struggle is not unique. It is the story of many nations trying to step out of inherited shadows. Sometimes that process looks unstable from the outside, but stagnation, though quieter, is far more dangerous. I intend to live in a way that honors this responsibility, to speak carefully, to act deliberately, to protect this nation not with grand gestures but with consistency. And if history judges me, I hope it will say that I chose the harder path when the easier one was offered. The future of Burkina Faso will not be decided in courtrooms alone, nor in rumors, nor in foreign analyses. It will be decided by whether we remain faithful to our own worth. If these words have made you pause, reflect, or question what you thought you knew, then stay with this conversation. Listen closely as events unfold. Share your thoughts respectfully. And if you wish to continue hearing voices from Africa that speak without intermediaries, remain connected. History does not only belong to those who act, it also belongs to those who bear witness. And in times like these, bearing witness matters more than ever.